Once again, Hanukkah Sameach, everyone. May you all have a wonderful, joy-filled, happy Hanukkah. May you find some way to light and kindle the brightness of freedom and of courage and of hope to bring light into this world which so desperately needs it. So it's wonderful to be with all of you on this first night of Hanukkah, where we're going to immerse ourselves in this story of Torah, which has so much to teach us and which we have so much to contribute to as well. So we are in Parshat Vayeshev, which begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verse 1. I invite everyone to go ahead and unmute, and together we'll say our blessing of sharing Torah with one another. Recite our blessing. Baruch
atah Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu b'divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity of immersing ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. Once again, I invite you to go ahead and mute, and I'll share the opening passage of our portion, and then I'll invite others to have the opportunity to read as well. So once again, we begin with chapter 37, verse 1. Now Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan. This then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their fathers loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. Steve, would you like to begin at verse 5 of chapter 37?
There we go. Verse 5. Joseph dreamt a dream one time, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Do you hear this dream that I dreamt? There we were, tying up sheaves of wheat in the field. When my sheaf rose up and stood up straight, your sheaves then paraded in a circle around mine and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you so certain you will reign over us? Do you really expect to rule us?" So they hated him all the more for his dreams and for his words. He dreamt yet another dream and recounted it to his brothers, saying, "Look now, I have dreamt another dream, and look, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he recounted it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him, saying, "What is this dream that you dreamt? Your mother, your brothers, and I, must we really come to bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers detested him, and his father kept the matter in mind.
Thank you. Let me invite Dave. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 12?
Did you say Jay?
Dave.
Okay.
One time, excuse me. One time when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's, One time when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock at Shechem, Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "I am ready." And he said to them, "Go and see how your brothers are and how the flocks are faring, and bring me back word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. When he reached Shechem, a man came upon him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He answered, "I am looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they are pasturing?" The man said, "They have gone from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers and found them at Dothan.
Thank you, Dave. Let me invite Gary. Would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 18?
Near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it.
Thank you so much, Gary. Kim, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 25? You need to unmute, Kim. Thank you.
I say sorry. And they took him and and they sat down to eat bread, and they raised their eyes and saw, and look, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum and balm and laudanum on their way to take down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What gain is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and our hand will not be against him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. And Midianite merchantmen passed by and pulled Joseph up out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. And Reuben came back to the pit, and look, Joseph was not in the pit. And he rent his garments, and he came back to his brothers, and he said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a kid and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the ornamented tunic and had it brought to their father. And they said, "This we found. Recognize, pray, is it your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's tunic." And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth around his waist. A vicious beast has devoured him. Joseph is torn to shreds. And Jacob rent his clothes and put his sackcloth around his waist and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose to console him. And he refused to be consoled. And he said, "Rather, I will go down to my son in Sheol mourning." And his father keened for him.
Thank you, Kim, so much. Let me ask Wayne, would you like to begin reading at verse 36 and continue with chapter 38?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, chief of the guards. And it was at that time, and Judah went down from his brothers and turned to an Adullamite man, and his name was Hirah. And Judah saw a daughter of a Canaanite man there, and his name was Shua. And he took her and came to her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and he called his name And she became pregnant again and gave birth to a son, and she called his name Onan. And she proceeded again to give birth to a son, and she called his name Shelah. And he was at Chizib when she gave birth to him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was bad in God's eyes, and God killed him. And Judah said to Onan, "Come to your brother's wife and couple as a brother-in-law with her and raise seed for your brother." And Onan knew that the seed would not be his. And it was when he came to his brother's wife, and he spent on the ground so as not to give seed for his brother. And what he did was bad in God's eyes, and he killed him too. And Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, live as a widow at your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, because he said, or else he too will die like his brothers. And Tamar went and lived at her father's house.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Let me ask Jackie and Tom, would you like to begin reading at verse 12?
Yes, Time passed, and Shua's daughter, Judah's wife, died. And after Judah was consoled, he went up to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, toward Timnah. When Tamar was told, look, your father-in-law is going up toward Timnah to shear his sheep, she discarded her widow's garb, covered herself up with a veil, wrapped herself up, and stationed herself at the entrance to Enaim on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, yet she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he turned toward her on the road and said, pray, let me couple with you. He was not aware that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me to couple with me? He replied, I will send you a kid from the flock. But she said, only if you give me a pledge until you send it. He asked, what sort of pledge should I give you? She then said, your signet seal, your cord, and the staff in your hand. So he gave them to her and coupled with her, and she became pregnant by him.
When he got up and left, she discarded her veil and put her widow's garb on her widow's garb. But when Judah sent the kid by way of a Dulamite friend to redeem the deposit from the woman, he did not find her. And when he asked the people of her place, where is that cordian, the one that was at the crossroads, they replied, there wasn't any cordian here. Courtesan, excuse me. He returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. Moreover, the people of the place said, there never has been a courtesan here. Judah then said, let her keep it, lest we become a laughingstock. I send the kid through you who could not find her.
Thank you so much, Susan and David. Would you like to begin reading at verse 24?
And it happened about 3 months later that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the whore, and what's more, she's conceived by her whoring. And Judah said, take her out to be burned. Out she was taken when she sent in to her father-in-law, saying, by the man to whom these belong, I have conceived. And she said, recognize, pray, where are this seal and cord and this staff? And Judah recognized them, and he said, she is more in the right than I, for have I not failed to give her to Shelah, my son? And he knew her again no more. And it happened at the time she gave birth that, look, there were twins in her womb. And it happened as she gave birth that one put out his hand, and the midwife took it and bound a scarlet thread on his hand to say, this one came out first. Go ahead.
And it was as he pulled his hand back, and here his brother came out. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. And he called his name Perez. And his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, came out after, and he called his name Zerah. And Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and an Egyptian man, Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, chief of the guards, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was with Joseph, and he had a successful man. He was a successful man, and he was in his Egyptian Lord's house. And the Lord saw that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was with him, and his Lord, Potiphar, saw that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was with him, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh made everything he was doing successful in his hand. And Joseph found favor in his eyes, and he attended him, and he appointed him over his house and put everything he had in his hand. And it was from the time that he appointed him in his house and over all that he had that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh's blessing was in everything that he had in the house and in the field. And he left everything that he had in Joseph's hand and did not know a thing about what he had except the bread that he was eating. And Joseph had an attractive figure and was handsome.
Thank you, Dave. Now, Jay, Heiser, would you like to read beginning at verse 7?
After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives no thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her. One such day, he came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. She caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and he got away and fled outside." She kept his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to me to dally with me. But when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside."
Thank you, Jay. And let me ask, Martine, would you like to read beginning at verse 19?
Yes, thank you. When his master heard his wife's words, namely, "Your slave did these things to me," he was enraged. So Joseph's master took him and gave him over to the prison, the place where the Pharaoh's prisoners are kept, and there he remained in the prison. Yet Adonai was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and lent him grace in the prison warden's sight. The prison warden put all the prisoners of the jail in Joseph's hands, and whatever was done there was his doing. The prison warden never saw anything amiss with him because Adonai was with him, and because whatever he did, Adonai prospered. Keep going.
Sure. One more set of verses would be great.
Okay. After all this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker offended against their master, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was furious at his two officers, at the chief cupbearer and at the chief baker. He placed them under guard in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the very place where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned Joseph to them. He waited on them, and they were sometime under guard.
Thank you. Would you like to begin reading Richard at verse 5?
Yes, thank you. Both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed in the same night, each his own dream, and each with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were distraught. He asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you appear downcast today?" And they said to him, "We had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations come from God? Tell me about it. Then the chief cupbearer told his dream to Jacob. He had said to him, in my dream there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. It had barely budded when out came its blossoms, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cups was in my hand, and I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will pardon you and restore you to your post. You will place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as was your custom formerly when you were his cupbearer. But think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh, so as to free me from this place. For in truth, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, nor have I done anything that they should have put me in this dungeon.
Thank you, Richard. Joan, would you like to read a little bit? Okay, let me finish up our passage here. When the chief baker saw how favorably he had interpreted, he said to Joseph, in my dream, similarly, there were 3 open work baskets on my head. In the uppermost baskets were all kinds of food for Pharaoh that a baker prepares, and the birds were eating out of the basket above my head. Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you upon a pole, and the birds will pick off your flesh. On the 3rd day, his birthday, Pharaoh made a banquet for all his officials, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker from among his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him. That's our entire portion for this week. So much action happening in it. There's so much that we could discuss. I'd like to begin just by presenting you with a little bit of focused study that takes us actually back to the very beginning, the very opening of our Torah portion. And I'd like to open not with a direct reference to our Torah portion, but I'd like to begin by sharing with you some attention of the graphic that is on the study sheet that I prepared. At the very top of the study sheet is a graphic. It's work in ink and water on paper by an artist named Ami Oliver. He calls it ladder. And this piece ladder, and if everyone could just be on mute while we have our conversation until you have an opportunity, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. This piece that she calls ladder is one of a series that she's done with the concept of a ladder or several ladders. And I like this one the best because I like the colors of this one. But let me read to you what she wrote about this series that she did. She writes, ladders surfaced in the work I made there while she was living in Tibet in 2009. It's a reference to the Tibetans' desire to escape oppression and or attain enlightenment. Since then, the ladders have become a running motif for me at times, particularly personal and relevant when I lost my parents in 2011. As my sleep patterns are so out of whack right now during the coronavirus, I dream about these images and have realized my ladders walk the line between a DNA sequence and Jacob's ladder. This series will continue to evolve. What began as part of my Dharma diaries in 2009 currently reflects the anxiety of an unknown, unlike any other in our lifetime. I'm okay with the unknown part. Nature and science rock. It's the idiocracy that scares me. So I was fascinated by what she wrote here, connecting this image to, on the one hand, Jacob's ladder, which was in an earlier portion that we read about, Jacob and his dream of the ladder with the angels ascending and descending. And somehow connecting this to both a level of anxiety, what she calls the anxiety of the unknown, and yet somehow she finds that she's comfortable with the unknown part, at least the unknown within herself and what she encounters. She says she has some problem with some of the surrounding, I guess, human chaos that she sees around her. But it's fascinating that she also connects this image of the ladder with a DNA sequence. And in some of her other works, you can actually see the double helix structure a lot more clearly than you can see it in this one. Although even here, I think you can see perhaps this double image, if you will, of ladders that are folding in upon one another. And it's fascinating to think about the DNA molecule itself and how that might relate to our story here, because the DNA molecule consists of two anti-parallel strands of nucleotide chains which wind around one another to form this structure, this double helix structure. And the DNA molecule contains our unique genetic code, which is passed on from one generation to the next. So on the one hand, it's what makes us unique, and it's also what ties us to those who share the same DNA. So I want to see how we can take a lot of what this wonderful artist, Amy Oliver, has given us in terms of ladders and DNA and anxiety. And as she puts it, she describes it in her blog, she has kind of found her way through this pandemic period by painting through it. That has given her some source of both comfort and purpose and direction. So now I'd like to take us to the opening of our Torah portion and see what we can bring from what Amy Oliver has offered to us and see how it can help us open up for us this Torah portion. Our very opening begins by Vayeshev Yaakov, and Jacob settled. And so at the very beginning of this Torah portion, we have our medieval commentator Rashi, who pauses over this and begins to try and probe into what does it mean that Jacob settled. So here's his commentary on it. Jacob sought to dwell in tranquility, but then the rogades of Joseph sprung upon him. Rogades comes from the Hebrew meaning agitation. The righteous seek to dwell in tranquility, but the Holy Blessed One said, the righteous do not consider that which is prepared for them in the world to come to be enough for them. They seek to dwell in tranquility in this world as well. So the message from this midrash that Rashi is sharing with us is how presumptuous it is that even the righteous among the humans don't think that the kind of serenity and unity and peace and resolution that they will experience in the existence after their body dies, that they don't think that will be sufficient. They also want to have a sense of peace and tranquility and lack of strife and lack of conflict while they're alive in their human existence. And so that's seen in this midrash to be a sort of arrogance and of misplaced wisdom, if you will. I think also that Rashi is picking up on a comparison with something from last week's Torah portion. And the Hebrew really makes it quite beautiful, because in last week's Torah portion at chapter 36 and verse 8, it says, Vayeshev Esav, and Esau dwelt. Esau settled in the land of Seir. And then if you remember, those who read with us last week's Torah portion, what followed after that Vayeshev Esav, and Esav settled in the land of Seir, were about 34 verses describing the descendants of Esav, all the families, all the people that descended from Esau. So you have this sense of fulfillment and richness and expansion. And so here we have this Torah portion starts off similarly to that verse in chapter 36. This week's Torah portion starts with Vayeshev Yaakov. So it is as if Jacob too wants to have that sense of being settled in a place, just like Esau was. He too wants to just have this story told about him with all of these descendants and all this fulfillment and all of this expansion. And so the Midrash, as Rashi is presenting it to us, is kind of making a critique, saying to Jacob, that's not your way. That's the way for some, but your way is not meant to be that way. Your destiny, your DNA, your spiritual DNA is for a very different kind of story and journey. So we're going to take a more recent bit of commentary in number 2, and this is from the great Hasidic rabbi, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, who lived in the first part of the 19th century. He was born, I believe, about 1800, and he died in 1854. And he a great book after he died collected a lot of his commentaries. Mei HaShiloach was published in 1860, and so this is a commentary on Jacob settling Vayeshev Yaakov. So the Ishbitzer Rebbe quotes our verse: Jacob settled in the land of Canaan, in the land of his father's sojournings, which in Hebrew is Megorei Aviv. And then the Ishbitzer Rebbe goes on to comment. He settled in the land of his father's fear. So let's just stop there for a second, because what he's doing is he's playing with the Hebrew a little bit, because the word gur on the one hand means to sojourn. And from that we get, for example, the word ger, a stranger, someone who's sojourning. But the word gur also means to stir up strife. And so we have, from that we have the Hebrew word magor, which means fear or terror. So while the typical translation would be Jacob settled in the land of his father's sojournings, where his father had once traveled before, the Ishbitzer Rebbe is playing on the other aspect of that Hebrew word and says, he was settling in the land of his father's anxieties, in the land of his father's strife. So let's go on and see what he says. He settled in the land of his father's fear, in the land of Canaan, of humility. Here the Ishbitzer Rebbe is taking the word kana, which means humility, and saying that's where we get this notion of being in the land of Canaan, as being in the land of humility, of smallness. And there he sought to dwell in peace. So first of all, before we go on further, you can say, is this going to be a likely successful enterprise if you're now in the companionship of your father's own anxieties and fears and smallness? Do you think that's going to make for a place of peacefulness and absence of strife and resolution? And of course, the Ishbitzer Rebbe is now going to take us and say, that's not possible. So here, the Ishbitzer Rebbe goes on. This kind of peace obtains when a person behaves in such a way as to keep far from all doubt and guards himself from any evil act. That's the modality of so-called peace. But in response to Jacob's desire for such peace, God told him that as long as human beings live, in a bodily experience, it is impossible to behave with extreme wariness and fear and humility. For God wants human acts, and in this world, human beings must act in love in ways that are not completely clarified. Ishbitzer Rebbe seems to be saying the desire to have the absence of anxiety, to be able to live free from all fear, from all doubt, is in a sense an arrogance of wanting to have a complete sense of certainty about one's life, that you know everything that's going to happen, that you can solve every problem. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe says, that's hiding, that's not living. And that's not what God wants from us. God doesn't want us to be like Adam and Eve, hiding in the bushes. We have a job to perform, and to do it, you have to be able to deal with all the insecurities, with all the unknownness that is a necessary part of human existence. Remember what our artist said, Ami Oliver. She said, what began as part of my Dharma diaries in 2009 currently reflects the anxiety of an unknown, unlike any other in our lifetime. I'm okay with the unknown part. She's found some way that enables her to move through life even with its unknowns. And some way of doing that seems to be the painting that she does. And in particular, the painting of ladders, the ladders of Jacob. Let's continue with our little study sheet and see, what does the ladder have to do with this notion about living with anxiety or not? Our next bit of commentary is from an even more contemporary writer, one of the great commentators in the English language living today, Aviva Zornberg. And from her book, The Beginnings of Desire, she writes this, which is actually a little bit of commentary on what we've just read from the Ishbitzer Rebbe. She writes, the Ishbitzer suggests an eternal oscillation between extremes of fear and love, certainty and courage in the face of perplexity. A worldview based on fear and humility risks human atrophy. For such fear and humility, grant all power to God. Only a vision in which the plot is unclear, in which anomalies bewilder serene faith, and integrities are torn apart, can open the possibility of human action. Cognitively, action means the capacity to reintegrate the fragments of experience into new wholes, in remembering, to create something unprecedented, a personal language of self-description. Perhaps we would all like to have a sense of certainty about what lies ahead, what we're going to be doing next, and what awaits us. And it's nice to take a little bit of step back at this point, perhaps, and just have an overall view about what is the trajectory of this book of Genesis, perhaps indeed of the entire Jewish Bible. But the trajectory in particular of the book of Genesis is from Eden to Egypt. One way to view that trajectory, that movement from Eden to Egypt, is to see it as some form of punishment. But another way to see it, and I think this is perhaps what the Ishbitzer is getting at, another way to view that movement from Eden to Egypt is not as punishment, but as evolution. To experience that sense of displacement, of living with incertitude, is part of our training of becoming a spiritual adept, of living in this world. To have the skill of living in a world where we cannot know everything, where we cannot control everything. And so we get trained by reading this story and saying, this is the direction and the training that you need to have in order to live in this dimension of incertitude, which is learning how to live a life of ambiguity. So this is, we begin to develop this capacity, if you will, to act in a world where absolute clarity is not obtainable. And according to this trajectory that I'm sharing with you, that's not a curse, that's a promise. And let's think about what is the message that God gave to the person who really started off on this way, Abraham. God says, your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs. Now, again, one can think of that as being, oh no, that we're doomed. We're doomed to live in a land that's not ours. But a way to read it within this line of commentary that we're looking at tonight is, no, that's not a curse. That's a promise. That's going to strengthen you. That's going to be part of your training to learn how to live in a world where it is fallacious to think that you can know what's going to happen, where all you can live is a life of absolute clarity and certainty. We've talked before about how the Torah itself opens us up in this very first word, not with clarity, but with ambiguity. Bereshit. That very first word, in a sense, provokes us to do some work of our own to try and make meaning out of the ambiguity, rather than beginning with clarity and a sense of complete understanding, which all we need to do is absorb and memorize. No, the Torah is opening up by saying, the only way to get through this is to do some work and to figure this out yourself, to add something of your understanding to this journey. So there is a great novel that Thomas Mann wrote, Joseph and His Brothers, and in it, which is appropriate for us to be focusing in on now because we're now dealing with Joseph. And in it, Thomas Mann writes, it is possible to be in a plot and not understand it. So here's what's happening with Jacob and also with Joseph. The real challenge for Jacob is, does he understand what that dream was all about? Can he begin to translate and begin to comment on and thus realize and then live what that dream is all about? Can he actualize that dream, which is a potential for him? Can he read it? Does he understand it? And when he first wakes up, he doesn't quite seem to understand what just has happened. He seems to be amazed and stunned and shocked by it. And it's going to take him decades until he can begin to understand what that dream is all about. So when we think about the ladder, now we go back again to our artist who's saying, the Jacob's ladder makes me think of the DNA. That's what she says, of that anti-parallel, those anti-parallel strands that wrap together, wind around one another and create this double helix, that DNA molecule which transmits to us what is unique about us, which we then pass on to others as part of their inherited life experience, if you will. So think about that ladder and think about the DNA. Can Jacob begin to understand what is special about him, what his unique destiny, if you will, is all about? And so too, Joseph. Joseph too, like his father, is a dreamer. And we've seen his expression and affectation of his dreams. He uses his dreams in destructive ways. He causes conflict and animosity and jealousy within his family. And it's going to take him as well many years until he learns what this dream stuff is all about and how to use it in a way that's constructive and productive and healthy. And essentially, it has to do with using that gift that he has, not for self-aggrandizement, not for drawing attention to himself, but for serving others, to interpret other people's dreams. And ultimately, by interpreting Pharaoh's dream, he assumes the role of being able to literally save virtually the entire world from dying of starvation. So I think about this holiday that we're reading this Torah portion on, Hanukkah. And one of the things that we do during Hanukkah that's custom is we play with this, right? This dreidel, a dreidel. And on the dreidel, we have these letters that represent the phrase that Nes Gadol Chaya Sham, a great miracle happened Sham there. Oh. And so I think about Jacob's dream. He wakes up from this dream and he's shocked. He says, God was in this place. God was here. I didn't realize God could be here. Meaning, I thought God would be somewhere else. I didn't know God would be here. Oh. I thought perhaps God would be back at home with mom and dad. I mean, that was the center of everything. That's where the stories got told. That's where the food got made. That's where dad would tell all these stories about our ancestors. I thought that's where God was, located in that home there. And then he said, well, on the other hand, maybe God was up on that mountain that I heard stories about, Mount Moriah, where my father and my grandfather, something happened up there, something extraordinary. Maybe that's where God is. Or where else well, maybe God is in the synagogue. Yeah, that's right. Maybe God is in the synagogue, but I don't know. I don't know the prayers. I don't know the melodies. I don't even know Hebrew. And so I'm excluded from having access to God because I don't know all that stuff. I go there and I hand over my religious experience to some people that are standing in front of me, and they're the ones that are doing all the praying and the singing of the melodies and the teaching and everything. And I'm just sitting there because I don't know any of this stuff. They know it better than me. And so God must be there in the synagogue and with those people that are leading things. So this takes me to honor both the Ishbitzer Rebbe that we just read about, also honor Rabbi Shmuel Zalman, who is the founder of what becomes known as Chabad Judaism, who's this last weekend. What was the anniversary of that? So I want to take us back to the origin of the Hasidic enterprise and take us to Jacob and his dream about Sham and how we need to rewrite that letter for ourselves. The origin of the Hasidic enterprise is that it was a response in the Jewish world to piety having been ceded to the rabbis of the study hall. Everyone said, oh, the wise, the righteous, and the pious, those are the rabbis who are studying Torah and Talmud. Me, all I do is I dig up potatoes from the field every day. Me, all I do is I milk some cows. Me, all I do is I take my scythe to the hay. I don't know how to pray. I don't know how to read Hebrew. I don't know anything about the Talmud. They're the ones that have piety and are close to God. The Hasidic movement intercedes at this moment of despair in Jewish life, and they begin to train people to discover the spiritual powers that dwell within themselves, to kindle the flames of passion and love that dwells within each one. And the Hasidic movement makes a lot of that phrase that we will read about soon in the book of Exodus. Let them build for me a Mishkan, and I will dwell within them. And so the Hasidim say, yeah, it doesn't mean a building. You're the building. You're the place where God dwells. And that's what you need to activate. It's not outside of you. It's inside of you, that power. And so this is the struggle that Jacob and Joseph and all of us deal with. That there's not some external power that's going to come save us. It's the internal power that we need to actualize and externalize. So I hope for each and all of you that, especially during this holiday of Hanukkah, that you kindle the light within yourself, and that you will be a beacon to the whole world, as we're encouraged to place our Hanukkah in the window as a beacon to the world. This message about our power and our commitment to truth and beauty and freedom. You're all beautiful people, and I know you have a beautiful light to share with the world. So let me invite some of that beauty to come forth and share what kind of things provoked you and interested you in this Torah portion. So if you'd like to raise your hand, I'd be so happy to call upon you. Yes, Martine, go ahead and unmute and share what you'd like.
Well, I'm so glad that I picked my DNA mug to drink out of today. Seemed to be fortuitous. And it just fits in so well with this chapter on the subtitle of which in my version is Trials, Tribulations, and Changing Circumstances. And that's exactly what we're in the middle of. And you speak of, when you talked about evolution, I looked at it as DNA evolution, and that so much of it is random and uncertain, that it's a random mutation, and whether that happens to work or not in a particular environment. And the fact that we as humans share the majority of our DNA with every other being, every other living thing on the planet. And in some cases, it's less than 1% of our DNA that's different between us and another species. And it's so interesting, not know. And then taking that over to what's happening now with the coronavirus. And again, it's DNA or RNA. And the uncertainty of how the illness is going to affect a person. I related that to the end of this chapter, or I should say the end of this parsha, with the cupbearer and the baker, that they both seem to have transgressed against the Pharaoh, but there's no explanation as to why the baker lives and why the baker dies and why the cupbearer lives. And to me, it just is mirroring exactly what's happening, that it's very difficult to tell. There's no rhyme or reason, it seems sometimes, as to who, is asymptomatic and who will die.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you. It's very profound. Thank you so much. Yeah, Wayne.
I had a comment about Hanukkah and then a question about this parsha. I couldn't help but think, as we were lighting the menorah tonight, that we are lighting a rigid formation. A candle is hardened. It's firm. It's unmistakable. And as we lend light to it, it melts. It enables itself to be reformed. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor for us to enable the light to come into our souls and into our lives and enable change, enable us to find a new definition of who we are, maybe a new way we do something, maybe a new relationship, maybe we stop being so rigid in our beliefs. And I know I can really get that way a lot. So I thought that for me was a very good message to start Hanukkah. The question I had, or the comment I had about this parsha, it's very disturbing, and yet we spend time, and I don't mean just us here, but the commentaries that you read and people that choose to write about it tend to gloss over the very disturbing parts in this parsha. There's rape, there's what appears to be by God a disproportionate amount of anger that God exhibits on things that don't seem to be all that bad relative to God looking the other way on other behavior that might be even more abhorrent. And that bothers me. And I don't know how I get through that, but it concerns me that there could be the treatment of certain people in such a way that's so harsh, that's overlooked, and other times where God decides to kill that person.
I think to the extent that you make use of this material to clarify for yourself what is a sense of justice and how to live a life of justice, I think the material has served you well. You've served the material well in return. Thank you.
Thank you.
Others would like to share?
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yes, dear. Kim.
No, I'm reading a book by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. And when you mentioned her, I go, oh, wow. It's not a book that's easy to read. The one I'm reading is The Murmuring Deep.
Yes.
And as I read it, it reminds me of you. And it reminds me of you because I have to really think when I have to really be really focused and think about the things you say. And it's the same thing with this book. And another thing that struck me that I'm not sure exactly what you said and how I remember it, but it brought to mind the destruction of the first temple. And a lot of people are very sad about that, but for me, I see it as evolution because I think it was very important to stop these animal sacrifices and all that, and to have the rabbis teach us. So that was another thought I had. I just want to say that.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. I'll get back to that in just a second. Let me ask Richard, did you have something? And you'll need to unmute. Go ahead. Richard, you'll need to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. In response to what she said about progressing beyond the temple, I like that Amos is in our Haftorah today. But the thing that got me was, or that I focused on, was the words idiocracy and tranquility. And we've talked before about how there's nothingness, the emptiness of everything, and that in a tradition I know, there's wisdom and there's tranquility, and tranquility goes to oblivion. But with wisdom and the recognition that tranquility of you're not bothered by anything out there. But if you have the wisdom to understand that the things that come against you are really empty, they're just empty forms. You stay in the world and do the work. And out of that, you develop compassion. And that's why I think perhaps, or I can see that our going to Egypt was a way to learn suffering and to learn compassion, so that we'd come back, and the Buddhists would call it become a bodhisattva. You have some wisdom, you don't get tangled up in this when it hits you. The idiocracy is there. And you can get angry about it and yell about it and blog about it, but it's there. And it's intrinsic to what goes on in a corrupted government that it's constantly pouring that out and gives us the opportunity to gain more, not tranquility, but more wisdom about the human experience and be armored against all that stuff going up the ladder so that we continue to help one another continue to move in our spirituality.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments, and reflections? I marvel that we are reading this portion during this holiday of Hanukkah, which on the one hand, it might be perhaps maybe along with form, I don't know. It's one of those holidays that we learn about as children, so young, and we learn about in a childlike way about the oil and the Maccabees. And yet it is one of the most complex holidays in the Jewish calendar in terms of what is it really about and what really happened. And we are dealing with a story that doesn't even appear in canonized Jewish texts. It's outside the Jewish canon. And the only reference really to it in Jewish literature is very small mention of it in the Talmud, which is where we first hear the story about oil, rather than the historic account of Judah Maccabees fighting the Assyrians. And so the notion about we need to figure out for ourselves what meaning is. It's not something that's given to us. It's not something that we receive passively. Meaning is something that we are responsible for making a decision about. It's something that we're responsible for creating. And of all the miracles that we participate in, the only miracle that we are asked, in a sense, to replicate is a miracle that was manifested by human beings. Those who went in and kindled oil that lasted not 1 but 8 days. And so this takes us back, I think, to what the Ishbitzer Rebbe said towards the end of his commentary, which, let me read it again. God wants human acts. And in this world, human beings must act in love, in ways that are not completely clarified. In other words, God may part the seas. God may create a bush that never burns. But it was a human being that said, let's light the oil, even if there's only enough for 1 day, and it lasts for 8 days. Was the miracle the fact that the oil lasted, or was the miracle the fact that someone said, let's do it anyway. Let's light that fire. Don't tell me it can only last for 1 day and therefore we shouldn't do it. We're going to light it. That was the miracle. And that's within our power. So that kind of a human act of defying what seems to be impossible in the moment, to act in a way where we have no certainty about what the outcome is, but we know it's the right thing to do. That's the miracle. And that's within our power. I hope all of you feel that power within yourselves and know that each one of you is capable of performing a miracle. God bless you all. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Hanukkah Sameach.
May you miraculously talk somebody that's idiot, use compassion and bring them back to the middle.
Be well. Be well.